High in the misty mountains of Jamaica, hidden beyond the reach of empire, a new kind of freedom was born. They were called the Maroons, men and women who had escaped the chains of slavery and carved out a world of defiance in the heart of the Caribbean. While European planters ruled the coasts with whips and sugar profits, the Maroons ruled the forests with cunning, courage, and fire. For the enslaved, capture often meant a life of endless labor in the cane fields, where survival itself was uncertain. But for the Maroons, escape was not the end. It was only the beginning. They built hidden villages, fought guerrilla wars, and turned Jamaica's rugged terrain into a fortress no empire could easily breach. British soldiers, who once believed themselves invincible, soon learned to fear the forests, where Maroon fighters struck like shadows, disappearing before muskets could even be raised. For decades, these warriors resisted the might of Britain's empire. They signed treaties on their own terms, forcing the world's most powerful nation to acknowledge their independence. But their story is not just one of warfare. It is the story of a people who refused to be erased, who kept African traditions alive, and who transformed Jamaica's mountains into a sanctuary of freedom. This is the story of how the enslaved became fighters, how the hunted became hunters, and how the Maroons of Jamaica proved that even in the darkest times, freedom could not be extinguished. In the 17th and 18th centuries, Jamaica was the beating heart of Britain's colonial wealth. Its sugar plantations were among the most profitable in the world, fueling Europe's insatiable demand for white gold. Ships carrying sugar, coffee, and rum left Jamaican ports daily, filling London's markets and enriching British elites. But behind this glittering trade was a nightmare of human suffering. Nearly 500,000 enslaved Africans were brought to Jamaica through the transatlantic slave trade. Captured in West Africa, shackled in ships, and forced across the Middle Passage, they arrived to face unimaginable cruelty. Plantation life was a system designed not for survival, but for consumption. Men, women, and children labored from dawn until nightfall under a burning tropical sun. Overseers carried whips, punishment was swift and brutal, and rebellion was met with merciless violence. The death toll was staggering. The average lifespan of an enslaved African in Jamaica was fewer than 10 years after arrival. Planters calculated that it was cheaper to import new captives than to sustain generations of enslaved families. Communities were torn apart, languages erased, and cultural traditions suppressed under the lash of empire. And yet, within this brutality, the seed of defiance grew. Some enslaved Africans resisted silently through sabotage, slowing work, or preserving forbidden traditions. Others chose open defiance, escaping into the rugged mountains and dense forests of Jamaica. These runaways, known as Maroons, refused to accept the fate of slavery. High in the mist-covered hills, far from the cane fields, they built hidden settlements. They carved freedom out of the wilderness, hunting, farming, and living beyond the grasp of planters. Over time, these scattered bands became organized communities, uniting under leaders, building networks, and preparing for war. Jamaica was supposed to be Britain's jewel, but in its mountains, a new threat to empire was rising. One that no whip, no chain, and no musket could easily silence. The story of the Jamaican Maroons begins in the earliest days of colonial rule, when the island was still contested ground between European empires. Before the British captured Jamaica from Spain in 1655, enslaved Africans had already begun escaping Spanish plantations. Many of these fugitives fled into the Blue Mountains and Cockpit Country, rugged, forested terrain where European armies struggled to follow. There, they formed the first Maroon settlements. When Britain seized Jamaica, the enslaved population expanded dramatically. The British imported Africans by the tens of thousands to fuel sugar production. With this surge came more escapes. The wilderness became a beacon of hope, a place where the enslaved could vanish from the reach of the plantation and claim a measure of autonomy. These early Maroons were more than just fugitives. They were builders. In the thick forests, they cleared land for small farms, grew yams, cassava, and bananas, and hunted wild game. They constructed homes of wood and thatch, often hidden deep in valleys or perched on mountain ridges. Every settlement was a stronghold, carefully positioned to detect approaching enemies and difficult to assault. But survival required more than food and shelter. The Maroons developed a sophisticated system of communication. Horns and drums echoed through the forests, warning of danger or summoning fighters. Trails invisible to outsiders crisscrossed the hills, allowing rapid movement from one settlement to another. They used ambushes, camouflage, and surprise attacks to fend off intruders, drawing on both African traditions and hard-earned knowledge of the land. Most importantly, the Maroons forged unity. Runaways from different African ethnic groups, Akan, Igbo, Yoruba, and others, found common cause in freedom. They blended traditions, creating a new identity rooted in resistance. Oral histories, songs, and ceremonies preserved fragments of African heritage, while adapting to Jamaican realities. From scattered fugitives, the Maroons became organized communities with leaders who commanded loyalty and respect. These leaders, like Nanny of the Maroons, Kujo, and Akampong, would become legends, guiding their people in the wars to come. The British saw the mountains as obstacles. The Maroons saw them as shields. From the heart of this landscape, they prepared not only to survive, but to fight back. For the Maroons, freedom was not only the absence of chains, it was the creation of a new way of life. Deep in Jamaica's Blue Mountains and Cockpit Country, they built societies that were invisible to the planters below, yet vibrant with culture, discipline, and resilience. Their villages were hidden marvels, houses made of wood and palm thatch, blended seamlessly into the forests. Fields of cassava, bananas, and yams provided food, while hunting and fishing supplemented their diets. Every settlement was carefully positioned for defense, with lookouts posted at key ridges. If enemies approached, signals carried by conch shells or abong horns echoed through the valleys, summoning warriors in moments. The Maroons were masters of guerrilla survival. They cultivated the land quietly, never drawing attention. Their trails twisted through the dense undergrowth, confusing outsiders. They created caches of food and weapons so that even if one village was attacked, the community could scatter and regroup elsewhere. This ability to vanish and reappear became one of their greatest strengths. Yet Maroon life was not only about war. It was about preserving dignity in defiance of slavery. Oral traditions, music, and dance carried the memories of Africa. Drums beat rhythms that had once been banned on plantations. Songs told stories of ancestors, and ceremonies honored spirits that gave strength in times of struggle. Leadership within Maroon communities was respected and earned. Leaders were warriors, diplomats, and spiritual figures, guiding their people in both peace and war. Among them, one name stood out above all others: Queen Nanny of the Maroons, a woman remembered as both a military genius and a spiritual leader, whose legend endures in Jamaica to this day. In the mountains, the Maroons proved that freedom was not just possible, it was sustainable. They were no longer runaways hiding from the empire. They were a nation in the making, a society that had carved itself out of the wilderness, ready to challenge the might of Britain. By the early 18th century, the British could no longer ignore the Maroons. What had begun as scattered villages of fugitives had become fortified strongholds that defied capture. Planters feared them, governors denounced them, and armies were sent into the mountains. But the Maroons refused to yield. The First Maroon War erupted in 1728, when the British launched a campaign to crush the settlements and end the growing threat. But the empire underestimated its enemy. The Maroons had mastered guerrilla warfare long before Britain understood the term. The forests and mountains of Jamaica became their battlefield. Maroon warriors struck swiftly, ambushing British patrols, destroying supplies, and vanishing into the dense undergrowth. Muskets cracked from the shadows, then silence returned, as if the land itself had swallowed them. Trails that seemed clear to British soldiers suddenly collapsed into traps, leaving them confused and vulnerable. The Maroons' use of the Abeng horn terrified their opponents. Its sound echoed across valleys, signaling attacks or retreats. To British ears, it was an otherworldly cry, a reminder that the mountains belonged not to them, but to the Maroons. Despite sending thousands of troops, the British found themselves locked in a war they could not win. Disease, exhaustion, and the relentless hit-and-run tactics drained their strength. Meanwhile, Maroon leaders like Cudjoe and Queen Nanny inspired their fighters with both cunning strategy and unshakable belief in their right to freedom. For over a decade, the war raged. Plantations near the mountains burned, supply lines collapsed, and British morale crumbled. Eventually, in 1739, the empire bowed to necessity. The British offered treaties, recognizing Maroon independence in exchange for peace. It was a stunning reversal. The world's greatest empire had been forced to negotiate with those it had once called fugitives. The Maroons had proven that freedom could be defended, not only with courage, but with victory. By 1739, the First Maroon War had dragged on for more than a decade. British governors had poured soldiers, muskets, and money into the campaign, but victory remained out of reach. The Maroons, though smaller in number, fought with such mastery of terrain and such determination that the empire faced an unsettling truth. The war could not be won. Rather than continue a losing fight, the British offered something almost unthinkable in the colonial age: negotiation. In 1739, Governor Edward Trelawney met with Maroon leader Cudjoe to sign a treaty. The agreement stunned planters across the island. For the first time, Britain officially recognized the Maroons as free people. The treaty granted the Maroons land in perpetuity, territory where their independence would be respected. They were allowed to govern themselves, continue their traditions, and live free from re-enslavement. It was a landmark moment, a rare victory in an era when European powers held almost absolute dominance. But the treaty was not without compromise. In exchange for their freedom, the Maroons were required to stop harboring new runaway slaves and, more controversially, to help return future fugitives to their British masters. This clause created tension within Maroon society. On one hand, it ensured their survival as a recognized community. On the other, it placed them in conflict with the very people whose suffering they had once shared. Despite its flaws, the treaty marked a turning point in Jamaica's history. The Maroons had forced the greatest empire on earth to treat them not as property, but as a people with sovereignty. It was a declaration that freedom could be won, not by royal decree, but by resistance. From fugitives to warriors, from warriors to treaty signers, the Maroons had carved out a place for themselves in history. But peace with Britain would not last forever. The next century would test their independence again and again. More than half a century after the first treaty, tensions between the Maroons and the British flared once again. The Peace of 1739 had secured freedom for the Maroon towns, but it also bound them with obligations that weighed heavily. They were expected to return runaways, to serve as allies of the colonial government, and to remain under constant scrutiny. For decades, this uneasy balance held, but by the 1790s, it collapsed. The spark came in Trelawney Town, one of the largest Maroon settlements. Disputes with local planters, accusations of treaty violations, and resentment over British interference pushed the community toward defiance. When the colonial government attempted to assert control, the Maroons resisted. War ignited once again. The Second Maroon War was shorter than the first, but just as fierce. Maroon fighters, numbering only a few hundred, held off thousands of British troops. They returned to the guerrilla tactics that had brought them victory before: ambushes in the dense cockpit country, sudden strikes at supply lines, and uncanny use of the land's labyrinth of caves and ridges. British soldiers, weighed down with heavy packs and muskets, found themselves outmaneuvered at every turn. The Maroons seemed to melt into the wilderness, only to reappear miles away. Casualties mounted, morale plummeted, and once again the Empire realized it faced an enemy it could not easily defeat. But this time, betrayal and politics carried the day. Governor Alexander Lindsay offered peace talks, promising fair terms. At the same time, the British used bloodhounds imported from Cuba to track Maroon fighters, breaking their mobility. Caught between exhaustion and pressure, the Maroons of Trelawney Town surrendered in 1796. The cost was devastating. Despite promises, the British exiled nearly 600 Maroons from Jamaica, shipping them first to Nova Scotia and later to Sierra Leone in West Africa. Families were torn apart, and Trelawney Town was left shattered. The Second Maroon War proved both the strength and fragility of Maroon independence. They had fought Britain to a standstill again, but this time, the Empire used exile instead of treaties to weaken their power. Still, the legacy of defiance lived on, for the Maroons who remained in Jamaica, and for those who carried their traditions across oceans. While their battles against the British defined them in history books, the Maroons' true strength lay in the culture they preserved and the legacy they carried forward. For the Maroons, survival was not just about winning wars, it was about holding on to identity in a world determined to erase it. In their mountain strongholds, the Maroons kept alive African traditions that slavery had tried to destroy. Music, storytelling, and ritual bound their communities together. The abeng horn became not only a weapon of war, but a cultural symbol, its sharp call echoing through valleys as a reminder of vigilance and unity. Drumming and dance carried rhythms of West Africa, fusing with new Jamaican expressions to create a living heritage. Spirituality played a central role. The Maroons practiced a blend of African religious traditions and adapted forms of Christianity, weaving faith into daily life and resistance. Leaders like Queen Nanny were remembered not only as military commanders, but as spiritual figures whose visions and guidance inspired fighters. Oral histories described her as having almost supernatural power, able to call bullets out of the air or summon ancestors for protection. Whether fact or legend, her image embodied the spiritual backbone of the Maroon struggle. The Maroons also established systems of governance and justice within their communities. Councils of elders made decisions, leaders were chosen for their wisdom and strength, and disputes were resolved internally. These systems gave them autonomy, ensuring that they were not dependent on colonial authorities for law or order. Over generations, the Maroons became symbols of resistance far beyond Jamaica. Their story inspired other enslaved people across the Caribbean and the Americas, proof that defiance was possible and that communities of freedom could survive in the shadow of empire. Even when some treaties forced compromises, the memory of their struggle lived on as an example of dignity carved out against impossible odds. Today, Maroon descendants still live in Jamaica, in towns like Accompong and Moortown, where traditions, ceremonies, and annual celebrations keep the legacy alive. The Maroons are not just a memory, they are a living culture, carrying forward the spirit of those who first declared that they would never be enslaved again. The Maroons were more than a Jamaican story. They were part of a global pattern of resistance that stretched across the Atlantic world. Wherever slavery existed, so too did rebellion, and the Maroons stood as one of the clearest symbols of that defiance. In Jamaica, they reshaped the balance of power on the island. By forcing the British to sign treaties in the 1730s, they created a precedent that enslaved people could never be fully subdued. Their independence undermined the planters' claim to absolute control. The very existence of free black communities beyond the reach of plantation discipline terrified slave owners and inspired those still in bondage. Globally, the Maroons were part of a wider tradition. In Suriname, escaped Africans formed Maroon societies that fought Dutch colonists for centuries. In Brazil, the community of Palmares grew into a kingdom of fugitive slaves. Across the Americas, from Louisiana to Cuba, Maroon settlements sprang up wherever geography offered shelter. Swamps, mountains, forests. Each one a pocket of defiance against empire. But Jamaica's Maroons were unique for their longevity and their visibility. They did not merely hide. They negotiated, fought, and forced the empire to recognize them as a political force. In the age before Haiti's revolution, the Maroons represented the possibility that slavery could be resisted successfully, even if only on a local scale. Their impact rippled forward. During the Haitian Revolution of the 1790s, leaders like Toussaint Louverture and Dessalines inherited a tradition of guerrilla war and mountain resistance that echoed the Maroon playbook. The idea that the enslaved could turn their captors' weapons against them, outlast imperial armies, and carve new nations from old empires had been proven in Jamaica long before it triumphed in Haiti. In Jamaica itself, the Maroons became a complex symbol. To the enslaved, they were proof of freedom's possibility. To planters, they were both feared enemies and reluctant allies. To the empire, they were an inconvenient reminder that Britain's jewel was never fully under control. Today, the Maroons' place in history reminds us that resistance was never a rarity. It was constant. Every plantation had rebellion simmering beneath the surface. The Maroons were the embodiment of that resistance, a people who refused to bow, and in doing so, forced the world to acknowledge their humanity. The legacy of the Maroons is not locked away in dusty archives or fading legends. It is alive, carried by their descendants in Jamaica and honored across the world. In towns such as Accompong, Moortown, Charlestown, and Scots Hall, Maroon communities still exist, tracing their lineage directly to the freedom fighters who carved out independence centuries ago. These towns maintain cultural traditions, ceremonies, drumming, storytelling, and the use of the abeng horn as living reminders of their ancestors' resilience. Every year, Maroons gather for festivals to honor their leaders, especially Queen Nanny, who remains a national heroine of Jamaica. Her image appears on the Jamaican $500 bill, and her story is taught as a symbol of resistance and pride. The Jamaican government, along with UNESCO, has recognized Maroon heritage as part of the world's cultural treasure. Moortown, for instance, has been acknowledged for preserving unique oral traditions and music that bridge Africa and the Caribbean. This recognition ensures that the Maroon story is not just remembered, but celebrated globally. Yet, the Maroon legacy is not without challenges. Modern descendants wrestle with questions of identity, land rights, and their place in Jamaica's wider society. Tensions sometimes rise between Maroon autonomy and national authority, echoing the centuries-old struggle for recognition. But through it all, the Maroons maintain that their independence, earned in blood and fire, is not negotiable. Beyond Jamaica, the Maroon story continues to inspire. In African diasporic communities across the Americas, they stand as a reminder that resistance was possible, that freedom was fought for, and that victory, however costly, could be achieved. For activists, artists, and historians, the Maroons symbolize dignity, defiance, and the refusal to be erased. The Maroons' survival into the present day is itself a triumph. They are living proof that the chains of slavery could be broken, not just in theory, but in practice, and that even against the greatest empires, the will to be free could endure. The story of the Jamaican Maroons is one of the most remarkable in the history of the Atlantic world. Born from the brutality of slavery, forged in the fire of resistance, and sustained by culture, they transformed from fugitives into freedom fighters, and from freedom fighters into a people who forced an empire to acknowledge their sovereignty. Their battles against Britain were not merely military conflicts. They were struggles for identity, survival, and dignity. In an age when enslaved Africans were treated as property, the Maroons proved that humanity could not be erased. They showed that freedom was not a gift to be granted by rulers, but a right to be seized by those willing to fight for it. The First Maroon War ended with treaties that recognized their independence, a victory almost unimaginable in the 18th century. The Second Maroon War revealed the fragility of that independence, but it also demonstrated their unbreakable resolve. Even exile could not erase their legacy, for Maroon traditions survived both in Jamaica and across the diaspora. Culturally, the Maroons preserved African traditions, creating a living heritage that endures in Jamaica today. Spiritually, they carried stories of leaders like Queen Nanny, whose vision and courage made her a legend. Globally, they inspired generations of freedom struggles, from Suriname to Haiti, from the swamps of the American South to the mountains of Brazil. The Maroons remind us that slavery was never uncontested. At every moment, there were those who resisted, with song, with sabotage, with escape, with war. Their story tears away the myth of submission and replaces it with a history of defiance. From chains to freedom fighters, the Maroons stand as proof that even against impossible odds, liberty could be won. Their legacy lives not only in the hills of Jamaica, but in the enduring truth they left behind. Empires fall, but the will to be free endures.